I've been within 5 to 7 seats, not rows, of people performing various sexual favors on each other, 4 times. The worst one, the movie Jack the Giant Slayer, about a week before it was going out of theaters. 2 people walk into the nearly empty theater, me, GF and maybe 4 other strangers spread out. They sit in the same row as us but with decent space in between us and them. They look relatively normal, until the girl smiles at the guy. She has no teeth. I'm talking full-on meth smile. They get all cuddled up as the previews start and the guy's hand is down her shirt. Whatever, not too bad. The movie starts, and his hand is down her pants. She's looking around nervously but not stopping anything. Then, the dude's dick was out. He had a real shower, I mean 2 or 3 shriveled up inches, no offense anyone, but that detail is important later. The girl is giving him a handy but he can't get it up. So she moves on to something a little more intense. At this point my lady friend and I aren't even watching the movie. Our gazes were locked onto the porno, not even trying to hide it. The meth smile girl starts gumming this dude's dick. I mean, really gumming this thing. Full dick coverage, hands on balls, just annihilating this thing. So this dude is finally hard and they decide it is time to get really into it. The girl was going commando, so about 4 seconds passed and his dick was up her ass. Judging by the smell, she didn't have a very healthy diet. The dude comes in about 2 minutes and then puts his stuff away. The movie ends and we stand up to leave. I turn to go and my girlfriend says, oh my god, falling pies, look at them. I turn around and there it is. This dude didn't have the length to come inside of her, and he had some sort of sprinkler system for a penis. Jizz, blood and anal juices are all over this girl's back and legs. Her calf-high white socks look like she had kicked something to death in the middle of a swamp. Her jorts were a Rorschach test of leakage. We stopped and gawked at these people, as they walked out like nothing is wrong. I haven't been to a theater since then. I went to the movies last night, The Guardians of the Galaxy, which was awesome BTW, and my wife and I arrived about 30 minutes early. It was eerie, and it reminded me of a time when I was in a theater to see the movie Signs years ago, and being a single man, I went alone on a slow mid-afternoon day. So I decided to tell her the story, which I'll share with you here. I regret telling her, though, because it ruined the mood for her. Anyhow, I think this is appropriate to post here. So a few years back, I wasn't enthusiastic about seeing the movie Signs because, although I enjoyed The Sixth Sense and, to a degree, The Village, the ending sucked. As with most of the director's movies, I've found Night Shyamalan movies to be big letdowns. But nothing else was on, so I went to see Signs. I've always been a fan of aliens and mysteries, so I thought I'd give it a shot. It was on an off day, probably Tuesday or Wednesday, and hardly any customers or workers were in the theater. Signs had just come out, so it was being featured in one of the 2 largest theaters. It probably holds around 400 to 500 seats, I'd estimate. Maybe more. So guess what, I was the only person in there. I arrived a bit early, maybe 15 minutes before the previews, so I expected to be alone for a while, but the big doors closed and the previews came and went, the movie started, and there I was smack dab in the middle of the theater with absolutely nobody else around. You might be thinking, well, it was the daytime. And Signs wasn't that scary, so no big deal. Well, you're right, in the daytime, the movie isn't that scary, but in the theater, it's always pitch black. This theater was exceptionally large, and being a low-lit movie due to the director's attempt at making a sinister, foreboding atmosphere, I could barely see the seats next to me except for the daytime scenes when I could see the perimeter of the seating. During the first act, when Mel Gibson is out in the cornfield searching for his son, I admit, I was creeped out a bit. It was suspenseful, albeit, in general, a not very good movie, and being dark, I fell right into the director's atmosphere and started glancing around, seeing if I were really alone, and hoping I wasn't alone. That's when I saw a silhouette. The outline of the man was up towards the front. I was relieved at first, in a weird way. I was just happy I wasn't alone, and it helped me not be a chicken enough to leave the theater due to the creeps. The next scene and he was gone. No kidding, I thought my eyes had been playing tricks on me earlier and that the man wasn't there. I thought it was a man, anyhow. He had a man's hat on, similar to a cowboy hat. I actually recall thinking the film looked a bit similar to the Mystery Science Theater shows with him down there, lol. Anyhow, another scene hit, and it was dark, and they're creeping around the house and the cornfield in the movie, and I can barely make the silhouette out again. It was definitely someone in the theater with me. I knew it. But something was different. He was on the opposite side than where he was earlier. I just figured he couldn't see from the strong angle, he was near the far edge of the theater, but that didn't make much sense since he'd switched to the other side in almost a perfect mirror image, 2 seats from the border of the walkway. Anyhow, the movie and the darkness admittedly made me want to move closer to the man. Why, but it always makes me feel more comfortable when I'm in closer proximity to people when I'm scared lol. I think most people are the same. So I got up and quietly moved down a few rows to where I was about 4 rows behind. He didn't react or anything, and being that he was probably 15 to 20 feet away, I didn't feel as alone in the big theater that dwarfed both of us. I could see his outline more clearly. We were both towards the edge of the walkway now, and we continued watching the movie. I didn't think he even knew I was there, but he must have seen me if he'd come in after the previews. Then this is where the silly part comes. I was still creeped out, and I decided to move a couple of rows closer. I'm realizing now that my behavior seems to be the creepy type haha, but in all seriousness I was just a kid who was barely old enough to get into a movie by myself, and I was a bit overwhelmed with the idea of being alone in a huge theater, where a couple years earlier I'd seen The Sixth Sense, which I admit really did creep me out. So I move a bit closer to the gentleman, and I noticed he was eating popcorn. He wasn't just eating it, though. He was wolfing it down. It was like he hadn't eaten in days. I remember thinking he had to have an endless popcorn barrel, almost like whose TARDIS or something, where it's much bigger on the inside due to some weird dimensional properties lol. He didn't even have a Coke or a drink or anything. And then, that's when I was sure he didn't even know I was there. I thought that if I'd suspected the end of the movie, I could move back to where I was. I wouldn't want the guy to get the wrong idea. I just was spooked. So that's when something happened that was totally unexpected, and I recall thinking that up to that point I'd been scared by the movie. What the man did was completely out of sorts. He glanced back, and I knew he had to see me out of his peripheral. I hadn't made a sound though. But he looked back, and he had to see me. I was certainly close enough. I almost said something to break the tension of the long stare. I say long, and it was about 5 seconds. Long enough to beckon some form of social response. He turned back at the screen and started laughing. It wasn't an appropriate time to. It was the scene where Mel Gibson's character was having a flashback, I think maybe in a dream sequence. I haven't watched that movie since that day, so I've no idea on the specifics. I refused to watch it again. The man kept eating and kept laughing. It was uncomfortable. I wanted to sneak up and move back to my seat, but he knew I was there, and being that I didn't want to alarm him and maybe he thought I was just some guy that had come in really late, I just stayed there. It was silly of me. I just sat there. He kept howling and eating. I was wondering why he didn't choke on his popcorn. He was eating too much and laughing too hard to not choke. So the screen went black. I don't know if it was a power malfunction, but it was one of those parts in a movie you think might be dramatic, so it stays dark a bit longer than usual, but this was really a sort of technical malfunction because 30 seconds in, the lights still hadn't come on. No sound either. I started thinking it wasn't part of. Man, let me tell you, that was the most uncomfortable, scariest 2 minutes or so of my life. I heard the man breathing. He was wheezing. It almost sounded like an impersonation of a dog or something. It was closer than the man had been the last I'd seen him, though. I knew nobody else was in the theater. Needless to say, I was downright frightened, begging, pleading for the lights to come back on. I felt the seat next to me and started feeling my way down the long part of the row. That theater was so dark. I couldn't even see my hands or anything. All I heard was the wheezing. It grew louder. I knew the man must have been on my row or somewhere close, following me, so it seemed. Flashes of the aliens from the movie popped into my head. I felt this ancient sort of evolutionary urge to scream and stay quiet and duck at the same time. I kicked it into panic mode and just fumbled my way to what felt like the edge of the aisle, feeling seat after seat until I finally reached what I thought was the last. I tried to run up the aisle, but my shin hit another seat, and it hurt badly. Nope, I wasn't at the edge yet, but the wheezing grew louder, closer. Anyhow, I didn't know where the edge really was. It just seemed to be an endless row of seats in the darkness. I was scared out of my mind. This guy who I'd only a few minutes earlier tried to get close to was freaking me out, and I was in a dark movie theater with virtually no light. The noise got closer, but instead of getting louder, the closer it got to me, the quieter it was. The man was seeming to calm down as I'd stopped running. Finally the wheezing was just a foot away. I said something. What else was I supposed to do? He was clearly following me. My voice wasn't as deep as usual. I stammered, "You okay, man?" He stopped wheezing. And up to that moment I'd thought that being stuck in the darkness with some stranger wheezing louder and getting closer to you was the scariest thing ever. The dead silence in combination with knowing that some stranger was near you, chasing you and suddenly having it end, suddenly having no sound in complete darkness, that, I learned, was as scary as it gets. Such anticipation. I almost vomited from it. It was at that time when something else unexpected happened. It was pitch black, and after what seemed like an eternity in darkness, wondering if I would ever get to see light again and wondering if I was in a theater with a crazy man, when I noticed that I could see again. The light was blinding. The movie screen started flickering, and the movie came back on in bits and pieces, much like a poor broadcast on television. The doors opened. I immediately noticed that despite my scurrying along what seemed to be an endless aisle, I hadn't moved from my last spot. Not at all. I still don't know how that could be, but what I discovered later does make some sort of sense. Maybe. But the memory was just too creepy to really analyze afterward. It's been years, and after my theater experience last night, as you can see I was justifiably uneasy. There's just something about it, something so creepy being in a big place meant for hundreds of people but being all alone. So when the doors to the theater opened after the whole upsetting fiasco, and the dim lights came on, the ones that are showing immediately before the previews in all movies, and the movie stub guy came in and said, "Sir, the projector malfunctioned." Something like that. I couldn't see the other man in the theater, though. I knew that he must be hiding under the rows or something. Naturally I carefully stood up and briskly walked towards the open doors, not wanting to miss the opportunity to make it out and make contact with a normal person, letting him know I was in here. So out in the lobby, visibly shaken, a couple of workers were staring at me. The manager came over and offered me a pass to see the movie at a later showing if I wanted to. Naturally I just declined it, saying I didn't like the movie. I asked about the other man. I said it sounded like he was crazy or choking, something. In any case, I figured the guy would need some kind of help. The next thing that happened is what I'll never forget. When I mentioned the word choking, the manager turned pale. He cautiously looked at the workers, and the workers shook their heads. The manager said, "Well, sir, you were the only ticket holder for that movie." He tried changing the subject. "It hasn't seemed to sell during the off days," he said. I saw it, pretty decent ending if you want to come back with a friend. I'll even throw in another pass for you for all the trouble. I was silent. I wanted to say 1,000 things and I couldn't say anything. The looks on the faces of the workers and the manager said it all. They knew what I'd gone through. I could tell in a glance on their faces. They knew exactly what choking meant, as I found out a few years later. Turns out, my friend ended up becoming a manager at that same theater about a year after that incident. We hadn't caught up in a few months because he was so busy. So we went out drinking, and after the topic of the theater came up, I mustered the nerve to tell him the story. He had goosebumps by the time I'd finished. He asked me if I was kidding. He turned pale too, just like the other manager had. Did the others tell you who you saw? No, I said. My friend looked at his glass for a long 30 seconds, took a sip and looked up intently at me, right in my eyes. If I tell you, I may end up regretting it. I almost didn't want him to tell me, but I had to know. The man had been an avid moviegoer. He was autistic, from what I was told. He came to the movies every day. He would do daytime features because sometimes during the night shows, the kids who went to the movies would make fun of him. He loved popcorn, but Billy, as the workers called him, never wanted water with his popcorn. No liquids of any kind. He would wear his straw hat made by his mother, and even though he was a rather serious man in his late 40s, he loved coming to the movies because he laughed a lot. My friend said he was told by his fellow workers that the movies made him feel good. Well, tragically, because he was alone in the big theater one afternoon watching some movie, he choked on his popcorn and died in the theater. Nobody came to see him until the beginning of the next movie. The cleaning crew noticed his body. So I guess I had an encounter with the man's ghost. I think the poor guy had been in the theater the whole time, and right before he died, he was choking and asking for help with nobody there to help him. While I still get creeped out thinking of it, I more have compassion for the guy. It sort of makes sense why he was laughing at a suspenseful movie. I guess another thing worth mentioning is that this has happened to other people in the theater, including large groups. I just happened to be alone, and it was frightening. My friend said the reason the workers and the manager didn't mention the man to me is because according to movie theater legend, mentioning him means you'll hear his wheezing at night when you go to sleep. I hope that's not the case tonight.